Hey everybody, it's good to be back. We took a couple weeks off there around Christmas and New Year's. But we're back to the How to Read the Bible, a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible series. And I'm excited to jump into what could be kind of a controversial study today. So stay tuned and maybe give me the benefit of the doubt if I don't come across super clearly. But hopefully there's going to be some good discussion. Sometimes in the Bible, a passage is tells a story or includes a number particularly, and then in other places in the Bible, that story or that number is told differently. And so we look at these things and say, well, they're incongruent. They don't make sense. You can't reconcile these things together. Therefore, the Bible can't be trusted. Therefore, faith is useless. Therefore, everything is done. I'm over. And today we're going to address that particularly by looking at the next set of books. Last time we did 1st and 2nd Kings. This time we're doing 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Remember, all of these studies throughout the whole Bible are going to be stored on YouTube at Encounter Church, and so you can go check those out and catch up at any time. Let's jump right into our study today on 1st and 2nd Chronicles. All right, we have How to Read the Bible, Field Guide. I want to start off with a quote. This one is... We read the Bible as Christians literally, not always literally. Read each passage as it was intended to be read. Now that's the part already we're jumping off the bat because there's a lot of Christians, and I would say too that we should read the Bible literally. Of course, Jesus literally raised from the dead. That wasn't a metaphor. That his heart was stopped and he was dead and buried, and then he wasn't again. Paul is very, very clear that our faith hinges and hangs on that literal truth. But elsewhere in the Bible, Jesus himself didn't seem to want to be taken literally all the time. He wanted to be taken literarily, which is to say, sometimes there's a poem. Most of the Psalms, Song of Solomon, these are songs, these are poems. We should read them as they were intended to be read, not only always literally. Jesus, for example, said, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Nobody intended to take him literally on that, but literally, Jesus was saying, listen, sin is so entirely destructive. It is absolutely true that it's better for you to go into heaven without an eye or a hand than it is for your whole body to be thrown into hell. All right, so there's an important truth there that we'd miss if we just took it literally all the time. But when we read Jesus literally, Jesus, how do you want to be understood? And we're going to be humble enough to submit ourselves to however it is that we want to hear from you. Okay, so that's going to be important as we get into our study of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Today, if you'd like to, in a group setting, you can review a few of these questions. What do you know about Chronicles? What happened? Who's in it? When did it happen? List as many facts as you can right now. For the rest of us on the study on Facebook Live, we're going to jump right into it. And I just want you to know the theme of Chronicles right off the bat. Because if you're like me and a handful of others, you probably haven't spent a ton of time just doing a deep dive in Chronicles because, honestly, it's a little repetitive. It's the content of Kings just kind of retold in a slightly different way. And so there's a little bit of a shrug, like, I don't know, King seems to be a lot more interesting. Let's just go with that and kind of ignore Chronicles. Don't do that. Don't just ignore Chronicles. There's lots of great stuff here. But first, I want to share just the theme of the whole thing is Chronicles can get a little dry at times, let's be honest, because it's the entire Old Testament all squished into this one book, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is one scroll, but because of length of the book, they divided it into two. So we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The people who wrote it really intended for it to just be Chronicles. So the theme of Chronicles is the entire Old Testament, a story in search of an ending. So Chronicles is that story just trying to look for an ending. Let's jump in here. Summary of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Lots of repeat stories as kings, as 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So you'd be tempted to skip it. We already said absolutely don't. We do have to do a quick review over the King's material, and we have to figure out what was Kings trying to say and what was Chronicles trying to say. A review of Kings is how did we end up in exile? Well, the answer to that is we were unfaithful to God, who is always faithful to us. Now, that's important. How did we end up into exile? When these books was written is really important to understanding the purpose and then also the controversy of some of the material that seems to disagree with itself within the Bible. That question, when was this written? Kings was written as the people were in exile. So kings happened. They had some good kings. They had a lot more bad kings. And then all the people were being punished and taken into exile. And God says, listen, it's just not worth having you around as a nation anymore. We're going to reboot. We're going to start over. Well, they didn't know about the rebooting and starting over. Kings was written as they were in exile. They were at like their low point, right? And so the author of Kings sits down and says, listen, how do we get here? Well, we got here because we done messed up. I mean, we made every mistake you could possibly make. We had a couple of high points, but even so, they weren't even all that high. I mean, David messed up with Bathsheba. I mean, just this mess of two monarchies, two lines, the northern kingdom and southern kingdom. How did we get here? Well, we were unfaithful to God. God saw to it that he was going to start over. And God is always, remember, Kings ended with this just weird kind of ending line that says, this obscure king was brought up out of prison, given new clothes to wear, and sat at the table of the king who is now in charge of everything for all his days. It's just like this hope on the horizon that someday things would be different and things would be better. But how do we get up here? Listen, we were unfaithful, but God, turns out, is always faithful to us. Well, Chronicles is a little bit different. First word in Chronicles, I think it's just fun to point out, is the word Adam. That's where we're starting. Remember, it's a retelling of the entire Old Testament. Adam is the first word in the last paragraph, is this return of Israel from exile. Remember, it's the whole Old Testament. Okay, now we don't exactly know who the author of Chronicles is, but because of the content that comes out and some of what the author knew, for example, the king that allowed them to return, we know that it took place after the exile was finished, after that 70 years that they were in Babylon, all that Daniel material, we'll get to that later. They were brought back, they were allowed to come back to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild their whole lives and their livelihoods and their way of life after they came back from exile. And that timing makes a huge difference in the purpose of the story. Now, this great hope that they had throughout all kings and even in exile, they had this great hope that there would be this messianic rule, that there would be somebody, maybe David, maybe, I don't know, we're all looking for it, that there'd be this great messianic ruler who would sit on the kingdom, sit on the throne forever and ever and ever and rule over his whole kingdom. But it never happened. And we know that it never happened. They knew that it never happened because, well, things just kind of got worse and worse and worse until they were dragged off into exile. So it was the opposite of what they wanted to have happen. But that's exactly where Chronicles picks up to say, well, I think that we're still maybe looking for that. So what the author of Chronicle does is go back to the entire Old Testament and retell it in a way that brings emphasis to that messianic ruler who has not come yet, but by faith believes that he will come. All right, so let's go back and let's follow along to what the author of Chronicles does. So the author reshapes the stories of the past, especially David. The author spends a ton of time watching David to provide hope. Okay, hope for the Messianic king and hope for a temple. So those two themes are important, the Messianic king and also hope for the temple. And we know that because part one, the genealogies. There's going to be 3 parts, and I've added a bonus part at the end. It's like 1 verse long, but it's super important. Again, like this twist ending just at the last minute, just like in Kings. So I think that's fun. Okay, so First Chronicles starts in chapters 1 through 9 with a list of genealogies, starting with Adam. And you're like, you can't get any drier than reading a genealogy. It's like reading a phone book, except for you don't know who any of the people are. Like in a phone book, at least you might be able to identify. Like, oh, I recognize that last name. I wonder if they're related to so-and-so. Maybe just I do that. I don't know. But also, most of you don't know what a phone book is, but that's okay. Chronicles starts off, and it seems so boring and so dry. And you think, oh, you can skip over all this stuff, right? Wrong. Don't do that. The author here is summarizing all of the key characters in the stories. in the stories of the Old Testament, because the author is trying to separate out and tease out and put people in certain buckets for certain purposes in the retelling later on. So it's important. It's important to them. And the author is really sorting these stories, sorting these characters and these people out into two main lineages. Number one, the lineage of the Messianic king, trying to get up to King David. Number two is the line of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron. Again, the dual purpose of setting up the Messianic ruler along with the temple, which is very important. Okay, part two after that is really a retelling of David. And it's a different telling than what we had. Remember, Samuel had, 1st, 2nd Samuel had a lot of the content over David. And now we have the similar content in David, only it's all different, which is a little unsettling for Christians, especially Christians like me who are absolutely committed to the authenticity and infallibility of the Bible. Let's jump in here. What the author does is he tells the story of David, except for he skips over or he filters out all of the stories that highlight either David's failures or his weaknesses. So, for example, the persecution of Saul, throwing the spear at David and chasing him around, and that whole tale, all of that is filtered out. Chronicles just doesn't cover it, doesn't mention it. David and Bathsheba with the murder of her husband Uriah, all of that isn't covered. These are really foundational stories of David. Yeah, according to Samuel, according to 1st and 2nd Samuel, not according to Chronicles. All of that is so unnecessary that it's overlooked and filtered out immediately. Why? Is the author here lying by omitting some of this material? Now remember, different contexts require a different telling. So I'll just give you an example from my own life of the stories that I tell. This is maybe a couple years ago. I sat on two board of directors. One was for my neighborhood association, and the other one was for a Christian missions organization called Resonate Global Mission. They're different. My neighborhood association is a collection of homeowners just trying to make sure that I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and lawns are mowed. The Christian Mission Board was different in terms of our goal was explicitly so that everybody might know Jesus. When I got to each board, and I was asked to introduce myself, if you just looked at a transcript of the stories that I told, they'd be dramatically different. Right? A Christian Missions Board, I told stories about how I'm in love with the local church and I'd love to see a local church in every community around the world. I told stories about how I'm a pastor, how I'm a Christian, how I'm discipling myself, my family, those around me, right? All of this sort of stuff. Well, you'd have an entirely different version of Dirk if you looked at the transcript of just the story that I told about myself from when I became a board member on my neighborhood association, where I shared I lived in this neighborhood for so long. I actually sold one house, bought another house in this same neighborhood because I love it so much. These are the things that I like about it, and these are the hopes and the goals, the dreams that I have for it. I might mention I'm married, some kids. I might mention that I'm a pastor of a church in the area that also loves where we live as much as I do, right? But all of that stuff would just have a dramatic, different telling of really who I am. And I wouldn't say that I'm lying at all by telling these two different versions. No, I'd say that I'm being helpful. I'm being contextual in the purpose for why I'm here. So bring it back to the Bible, that's what's left in the story, is that we're seen as David being portrayed as a really good guy. He doesn't have a lot of weaknesses. He doesn't have a lot of failures according to Chronicles, because the purpose of Chronicles was to look for a messianic leader, whereas the purpose of Samuel and Kings was to explain how in the world did we end up in exile. Chronicles is notably more hopeful. Probably a book that you want to read in a pandemic, but I digress. Chronicles, part 2 here in First Chronicles, the preparations for the temple. David plans for the temple like Moses plans for the tabernacle. I think that's really interesting. There's like David and Moses kind of similarities, as David is like laying everything out and getting all set to go, and his son Solomon is going to actually follow through and build the temple based on David's plans. Chronicles is trying to portray David as an ideal king, a portrayal of David as an image of the future Messianic king. So Chronicles is saying, listen. I don't know. Obviously, the Messianic king has not come yet. But I think that Messianic king is going to look a lot like the highlight reel of this past King David. So be on the lookout for somebody who is like David's best attributes all the time. That's who we're looking for. But of course, neither David or Solomon was anywhere close to being that Messianic king. Chronicles, the author here, is convinced that king, that Messianic king, is still coming, is still on the way. Part 3 of Chronicles is 1 through 36, and we just have a retelling of some of the kings in Jerusalem. Now, because of the line, remember, it's all about the line of David, the line of Aaron, the line of the Messianic king, and also the temple, the priesthood. Really, no attention is paid whatsoever to the northern kingdom of Israel. I mean, that doesn't matter because they're the wrong line, right? So the attention is all paid towards the southern kingdom. So the kings that are sitting in the capital of Judah, the southern, which is Jerusalem. So after David dies, we just have a retelling of the kings in Jerusalem. Now it's just like 2 Kings, but of leaving out the northern kingdom, it's all about that lineage. And it kind of the key net out, the takeaways of this part 3 here is that obedient kings equals success and blessings. Unfaithful kings equals failure and hardships. And so one of the takeaways is Chronicles is saying, please, let's learn from our collective family history. I think that's really probably an important lesson for us all to keep on in mind is don't forget the lessons that you learned when things were hard or when things were good. Don't forget what you've learned already. Otherwise, you might have to relearn it again. I think that's true right now as we emerge out of the pandemic when we talk. And I know a lot of you have been journaling and discussing what you're learning, what you've learned to appreciate, and what you've learned not to take for granted anymore. Don't forget those lessons. Otherwise, you may just have to learn them again. But that's what the author does. Let's learn from our family history. And now that we're back from exile, let's do it better this time. Now, part 4 is the one that I said was kind of a bonus part. Really, there's 3. I added another one. It's just one verse because it's such a deviation from what you'd expect. It's such a twist of an ending, just like in Kings, when the last part was the king calling up this obscure king in Jerusalem, in Judea, and saying, hey, you're no longer going to be in prison. You're going to sit next to me. Well, this time you have something all equally obscure, but very important. Last verse in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the last verse in the whole thing ends this way. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. Really, what we have here is Cyrus saying, listen, if you want to go back and be out of exile, if you want to go back to Jerusalem, you can, which was huge, which is foundational. That's going to set up all of Ezra and Nehemiah, and Esther, the books that we're going to get to in future weeks. But literally how it ends in the Hebrew language that this was written in, it was an incomplete sentence. I drew the King James version of the Bible, which is very, very literal, very, very wooden, and doesn't try to make it easier to read. Some of you have read the King James, and you're like, yeah, they make no effort to make it easier to read. And that's why in church we often go with New International Version or something, Christian Standard Version, something that's a little bit more accessible. But it's great for looking at looking at Bible verses this way because you have more literal translation. So this is, I just lifted up the King James Version and it ends with, may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. That's it. That's how it ends. It just ends with let him go up. Let him ascend. Ascend what? Go up where? I don't know. Just up. And they didn't use punctuation back then, so I left a period out there, but they didn't have periods and punctuation to begin with, so that's just it. It's just done. And so it's like this accidental or intentional incompletion. So I said, this last part 4, is incomplete. Kind of. Why? Clearly we can see all of the effort I don't think it was just an accident. I don't think the scroll got ripped, and we never, found out how it ends or something. I think it was intentional, because all of this is so intentional. Clearly, in his view, the Messiah and the temple are not fulfilled yet. And the author is calling the people to look back in order to look forward. The Old Testament as a story in search of an ending. This author tells the entire story of the Old Testament, starting with Adam, all the way through the ending of the Old Testament, and saying, we're not done yet. We're still looking for that Messiah. And so if you're looking for like a recap of like what the whole Old Testament is about, Chronicles is a fantastic one. Don't overlook it. Don't skip it just because it's a lot of repeat content. Chronicles is fantastic because it's saying we're still on the lookout for how to get it right. And now we know that none of our kings can absolutely get this thing right. We're still looking for it. So the next question in our study is always this field guide. So where do we spot Jesus in Chronicles? Well, that's not that hard. David has come as close as anyone could possibly come to kingly perfection, but still he failed. If only, I love that line, just a couple of words here. This comes from Michael Williams' book, where a lot of this content comes from, How to Read the Bible Through the Jesus Lens. And he says this line is 2 words. If only there was a king in the line of David who would perfectly keep God's instruction. Such a king would be a picture of God himself. Such a king would ensure God's fellowship with his people. Such a king would know what true life really is and is all about. Such a king would lead his people to the enjoyment and fulfillment of that life. And Jesus is that king. And as we hand over our lives to him and put him in the driver's seat of our lives, recognizing him not only as our Savior, but as the Lord, the one who's in charge of our lives, we more and more belong in that king's kingdom as citizens of heaven. Chronicles is such a powerful, powerful book. Some group questions, and I'm going to leave these up on the screen here for a little while. Thanks for joining us. We're going to do this again next week. Facebook Live here Wednesdays at noon and every Wednesday at noon. Take care, everybody. We'll see ya.